Britain exported food from Ireland, while 1 million Irish people starved to death. This is not a metaphor. This is not an exaggeration. While families rotted in ditches along the roadsides, ships loaded with wheat, butter, and cattle left Irish ports under British military escort bound for London. At the center of this collapse was a single tuber, a misshapen root that Andean farmers spent 8,000 years perfecting, that the Spanish completely ignored, that Europe refused, banned, and associated with the devil for 2 centuries. And that, once finally accepted, became so indispensable that the failure of a single harvest undid the demographics of an entire country. The potato is not a food. It is the story of how one civilization was built upon it, how another was destroyed by depending on it, and how the entire world ended up living inside that legacy without realizing it. If this kind of story interests you, subscribe and hit the bell. And tell me in the comments, did you know Ireland was exporting food while the famine was happening? 8,000 years ago, in the mountains of the Andes, above the cloud line, at elevations exceeding 11,800 feet, wild potato plants grew scattered across the rocky slopes of what is now southern Peru and Bolivia. These were not the golden, starchy potatoes you would recognize. They were small, some no bigger than a walnut, and they were genuinely toxic. Wild potatoes produce solanine and tomatine, glycoalkaloid compounds that cause nausea, vomiting, cramps, and, in high doses, death. Eating these plants raw was not merely unpleasant, it was dangerous. The indigenous peoples who inhabited these mountains discovered this the hard way, across many generations. But they also discovered something that would change the course of human history. If you soaked these tubers in icy streams for several days, the running water drew out some of the toxins. If you then exposed the waterlogged potatoes to repeated cycles of freezing and thawing at extreme altitudes, where nighttime temperatures regularly dropped below zero, the remaining harmful compounds broke down. The tuber became safe to eat. It was a process that took days. It required patience, systematic experimentation, and a deep knowledge of chemistry that these farmers would never have described in those terms. But it worked. And over millennia, through the careful selection of the least bitter tubers and the replanting of the mildest specimens generation after generation, Andean farmers bred the poison out and the starch in. They did not know the word genetics. They were practicing genetic engineering all the same. By the time the Inca Empire consolidated its hold over Western South America around the 15th century, the potato had become something extraordinary. Inca farmers cultivated more than 3,000 distinct varieties on terraces carved into the steep hillsides around Cusco. Some were bright yellow, others deep purple, red, white, blue, so dark they looked almost black. Each variety was adapted to a specific altitude, a specific soil type, a specific microclimate. The Incas did not merely grow potatoes. They built an entire agricultural science around them. And through that science, they built a civilization. And they solved a problem that would stymie European farmers for centuries after them. Storage, fresh potatoes, rot. In a world without refrigeration, that is a serious problem. The Inca solution was brilliant in its simplicity. Farmers spread freshly harvested potatoes on flat ground at high altitudes and let them freeze solid overnight in the Andean cold. The next morning, entire families walked across the frozen tubers barefoot, squeezing out the moisture with their feet. They repeated this cycle for several days until what remained was a light, chalky, completely dry block that weighed almost nothing. Chuño lasted 5 years, 8 years, 10 years or more without spoiling. It was, without exaggeration, the first processed food in human history. It fed Inca armies on long military campaigns across the Andes. It sustained entire cities in years of scarce harvest. It was so central to Inca life that time was measured in part by how long it took to cook a pot of potatoes. and distance was measured in part by how much chuño a traveler needed to carry between 2 points. This was not merely a crop. It was the foundation of one of the greatest empires in pre-Columbian America. But what comes next changes everything, because the people who would eventually carry the potato to the rest of the world had absolutely no appreciation for any of it. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in South America in the 1530s, they were looking for gold and silver. They found both in staggering quantities. What they barely noticed, and certainly did not value, was the ugly tuber the people they were conquering ate at nearly every meal. Spanish soldiers and administrators brought a few potatoes back to the Iberian Peninsula around 1570, but no one was particularly excited. There were no celebrations, no royal proclamations. Potatoes were given to sailors on long voyages as cheap provisions to prevent scurvy, and donated to hospitals and monasteries as food for the sick and the poor. The Spanish crown, busy counting Inca gold, had no interest whatsoever in promoting a food that came from people it considered savages. That decision seemed small at the time. It was not. When the potato finally reached the rest of Europe in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the reaction ranged from suspicion to outright horror. Europeans grew wheat, barley, oats, and rye. These were grains, noble crops. They grew above the ground, in sunlight, reaching toward the heavens. Bread made from grain was considered a gift from God. Entire economies, entire feudal systems, entire civilizations organized themselves around the cultivation of grain. The potato, on the other hand, grew beneath the ground, in dirt, in darkness. It was irregular, misshapen, covered in small protrusions that people called eyes. And it belonged to the same botanical family as belladonna, one of the most poisonous plants in Europe. To many Europeans living in deeply religious and superstitious societies, this was not a botanical coincidence. It was a warning from God himself. Rumors spread faster than the crop ever could. In France, the potato was formally blamed for causing leprosy. The Parliament of Besançon banned potato cultivation in 1596 on the grounds that it spread disease. In Russia, the Orthodox Church called the potato the devil's apple and warned that eating it was a sin against God. In parts of Germany and Switzerland, people believed potatoes caused flatulence, uncontrollable lust, scrofula, and general moral corruption. Scottish Presbyterians refused to eat potatoes because the word potato appeared nowhere in the Bible, and therefore the crop could not have been intended by God for human consumption. For nearly 200 years after arriving in Europe, the potato sat in gardens primarily as a botanical curiosity. Wealthy people grew it as an ornamental plant. Its delicate purple and white flowers were considered quite attractive. Marie Antoinette wore potato flowers in her hair at French court events. Botanical gardens displayed potato plants alongside other exotic specimens from the New World. But eating the thing regularly? That was beneath the dignity of any self-respecting European. And then, just as it seemed the potato would be stuck in that humiliating position forever, two men changed everything. And the strategies they used reveal more about human nature than any psychology textbook. The first major turning point came in the Kingdom of Prussia. Frederick II, known to history as Frederick the Great, ruled Prussia from 1740 to 1786. His country was constantly being drawn into devastating wars with neighboring powers. During those wars, enemy armies burned Prussian wheat fields to starve the population into submission. Grain was easy to destroy. You simply set it on fire and watched it burn. But a crop that grew beneath the ground, completely hidden under the soil. An invading army could march across a potato field without ever knowing that dinner was 6 inches below their boots. Frederick saw the military potential immediately. In 1756, he issued the Kartoffelbefehl, which translates roughly as the potato order. He commanded Prussian peasants to plant potatoes, or face the possibility of having their ears and noses cut off. The peasants were predictably unenthusiastic. According to one widely repeated account, villagers from the town of Kolberg sent a message to the king saying that potatoes had neither smell nor taste, and that not even the dogs would eat them. Frederick was not pleased, but he was clever. Rather than continuing to threaten his subjects, he planted a royal potato garden on the outskirts of Berlin and posted uniformed soldiers around the perimeter to guard it. The message was obvious without being stated. If the king himself needed armed guards to protect these plants, they must be extraordinarily valuable. Prussian peasants began sneaking into the royal garden at night to steal seed potatoes for themselves, which, according to the story, was exactly what Frederick had planned from the beginning. Within a single generation, the potato had become a major staple crop across Prussia and much of northern Germany. Across the border in France, a man named Antoine Augustin Parmentier was fighting a similar battle with even more flair. Parmentier had been a pharmacist serving in the French army during the 7 Years' War and had been captured by Prussian forces and held as a prisoner of war for 3 years. During his imprisonment, the primary food his Prussian captors gave him was potato. Day after day, meal after meal, Parmentier ate potatoes. He did not die. He did not contract leprosy. He did not lose his mind or his morals. In fact, he emerged from captivity in surprisingly good health, better than many soldiers who had eaten the standard French military diet. This made Parmentier think very hard about everything his country believed about the potato. After returning to France, he devoted the next decades of his life to a singular mission. He would convince the French people to eat potatoes, even if it was the last thing he did. He hosted elaborate dinner parties for Parisian high society where every course, from the appetizer to the dessert, was made from potatoes. He presented potato flowers to King Louis XVI, who put them in his lapel and wore them around the palace. He convinced Queen Marie Antoinette to wear them in her hair at court events. And then he executed a version of the same play Frederick had used. He planted a large field of potatoes in the sandy, infertile soil of the Sablons Plain outside Paris, posted armed guards during daylight hours to make the field look important, and then conveniently pulled the guards away every night so that curious Parisians could come steal the plants. Parmentier was essentially running a solo public relations campaign for the potato decades before the concept of public relations even existed. And it worked. The French still honor him for it. The classic dish, hachis parmentier, essentially a French version of shepherd's pie, bears his name. There is a Paris metro station named after him, a boulevard, a hospital. The man gave his life to a root vegetable, and France returned his name to history. But while France and Prussia were slowly warming to the potato through clever marketing and royal endorsements, something very different and far more dangerous was happening on the island of Ireland. And this is where the story of the potato takes its darkest turn. Ireland in the 18th and 19th centuries was under British rule. The vast majority of Irish land belonged to English and Anglo-Irish Protestant landowners who often lived in England and never set foot on the properties they controlled. Irish Catholic peasants, who made up the overwhelming majority of the population, were tenants working small parcels of land they did not own and from which they could be evicted at any moment. British policies such as the penal laws had systematically restricted what Irish Catholics could inherit, purchase, which professions they could practice, and how much land they could lease. Entire families were pushed onto smaller and smaller plots of increasingly marginal soil. The potato was perfect for that brutal situation, almost as if it had been designed for it. 1 acre of potatoes could produce enough food to feed a family of 6 for an entire year. No other crop came close. The potato grew in poor soil where grains would fail. It grew in the wet, cool Irish climate that made wheat and barley unreliable. It required almost no equipment or investment to plant or harvest. No plow, no horse, no mill was needed. All that was required was a spade, some seed potatoes, and enough rain, which Ireland never lacked. A family could survive on potatoes and sour milk and almost nothing else. And the nutritional balance of that diet was reasonably complete. Potatoes provided carbohydrates, vitamin C, vitamin B6, potassium, and even some protein. Ireland's population exploded from roughly 3 million people in 1700 to more than 8 million by 1840. The potato made that staggering growth possible. But there was a catastrophic flaw built into that dependence, and anyone who understood farming could see it coming. Nearly all of Ireland's potatoes came from a single variety called the Irish lumper. Farmers did not grow multiple types. They grew one. This meant that every potato field in every county of the country was genetically identical to every other potato field. If a disease could kill one plant, it could kill every plant in Ireland simultaneously. There was no genetic diversity to fall back on, no resistant variety waiting in reserve, and absolutely no backup plan. The clock was already running. Ireland simply could not hear it. In the late summer of 1845, a cargo ship carrying potatoes from the Americas docked at a European port. Hidden within those potatoes were microscopic spores of an organism called Phytophthora infestans, a water mold that thrived in exactly the wet, cool conditions that defined the Irish climate. The blight spread through Belgium and the Netherlands first, destroying potato crops as it advanced. Then it crossed into England. Then it hit Ireland. The effect was nearly instantaneous and absolutely devastating. Potato plants that looked perfectly healthy in the morning were black, wilted, and rotting by afternoon. Farmers walked into their fields and found entire acres of lush green plants that had collapsed overnight into blackened, fetid mass. When they dug up the tubers hoping to salvage something, they discovered the potatoes had already turned into foul-smelling pulp beneath the soil. The stench of rotting potatoes became so overwhelming in parts of Western Ireland, in counties Mayo, Galway, and Clare, that people tied rags across their noses and mouths just to breathe. The first year was devastating. But what turned a bad harvest into an apocalypse was that the blight came back. It returned in 1846, worse than before, and again in 1847, and again in 1848. Year after year, the potatoes rotted in the ground. Families who had no other source of food began dying in their homes, on the roads, in the ditches alongside the fields where their crops had failed. Diseases like typhus, cholera, and dysentery swept through the weakened and malnourished population. Entire villages in Western Ireland were depopulated. Workhouses built to shelter a few hundred people received thousands, and mass graves formed behind them. Between 1845 and 1852, roughly 1 million Irish people died from famine and the diseases that followed it. Another million emigrated, many on ships so overcrowded and disease-ridden that they became known as coffin ships. Passengers died by the dozens during Atlantic crossings, and their bodies were thrown into the sea. Ireland's population fell by approximately 25% in less than a decade. The country never recovered that number. Even today, nearly 180 years later, Ireland's population is lower than it was before the famine arrived. The British government's response to the crisis made everything worse. While Irish families were starving, Ireland continued exporting grain, butter, cattle, and other foodstuffs to England under armed military escort. Relief programs were slow, underfunded, and tied to degrading conditions. Starving men had to perform heavy labor, building roads that led nowhere, in exchange for wages too small to buy the food that was rapidly becoming unaffordable. Charles Trevelyan, the senior British Treasury official overseeing famine relief, described the catastrophe as the judgment of God upon a morally inferior people and argued that providing too much aid would make the Irish dependent on charity. He wrote those words in official government correspondence, not in private. The famine was not simply a natural disaster. It was a natural disaster made catastrophically worse by political indifference and deliberate choices of public policy. What happened next, though, no one clearly anticipated. The million Irish immigrants who fled the famine did not simply disappear into the world. They reshaped it. Massive waves of Irish immigrants poured into the eastern cities of the United States, into Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, where they faced discrimination, poverty, and anti-Catholic hostility, but where they also built communities, labor movements, and political machines that would reshape American politics for the next century and a half. Irish immigrants settled in Liverpool, Glasgow, Melbourne, and Toronto. They carried with them a deep generational fury toward the British government that would fuel Irish nationalist movements for decades and eventually contribute to Irish independence in 1922. The Great Famine did not merely empty Ireland. It planted Irish communities, Irish culture, and Irish grievances across the entire English-speaking world. The reverberations of that dispersal are still visible today, and the lesson the world took from Ireland was not that potatoes were too risky to grow. It was that you can never bet everything on a single genetic variety. The catastrophe that nearly destroyed Ireland became the catalyst for a new era of agricultural science. Plant breeders began developing varieties with resistance to Phytophthora infestans. Agricultural scientists established seed potato programs to ensure genetic diversity. The disaster generated the tools to make the potato even more indispensable than before. Today, the potato is the fourth most important food crop on the planet, behind only wheat, rice, and corn. More than 300 million metric tons are produced every year in more than 150 countries. China produces more than 90 million metric tons per year. India is the second largest producer on Earth. In 1995, the potato became the first vegetable grown in outer space, aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia. If humanity establishes permanent colonies on the Moon or on Mars, agricultural scientists believe the potato will almost certainly be among the first crops planted. It grows in poor, mineral-lean soil. It produces more calories per acre than any grain crop. It requires relatively little water. It stores well under adverse conditions. The same qualities that made the potato indispensable in the Andes 8,000 years ago make it the leading candidate to feed human beings on another planet. Every civilization that has endured has a root that sustained it. Sometimes it is an idea. Sometimes it is a trade route. And sometimes it is literally a tuber that nobody wanted. What the potato reveals is not only about agriculture, it is about how power structures decide what has value and the catastrophic price that entire populations pay when that decision is wrong. If that mechanism interests you, subscribe. Every episode of this channel is one piece of the same puzzle. Leave a like if this story surprised you in a way you did not expect. And tell me in the comments, what other food or crop do you think changed the course of history in a way that most people do not know?